Chapter 1. The Night That Broke Open. Fog came in off the river like something alive. Mara Voss had learned long ago not to trust beautiful things. And the city of Veldrath at night was beautiful in the way that poisons were beautiful. Arresting, iridescent, and deeply, quietly deadly. Gas lamps bled amber into the cobblestones below. Carved gargoyles crouched at every corner of the old quarter's rooftops. Their faces worn smooth by centuries of rain, until they no longer looked like stone, and more like grief given form. She should not have been in the old quarter after dark. Everyone knew the rule. Not a law, not exactly, but the kind of understanding that lived in the marrow of every person born inside Veldrath's walls. The old quarter belonged to the houses after midnight. You stayed on the lit side of the Vale Bridge, or you accepted the consequences of whatever found you on the other side. Mara had never been good at accepting things. She pulled her coat tighter and moved quickly. Her worn leather satchel pressed against her ribs, her boots whispering against slick stone. She was a healer by training, a field medic before the clinic had closed, before the trial, before everything, and she still moved like one, low center of gravity. Eyes cataloging exits, breath controlled even when her heart was not. Old habits. They were all she had left. She was 3 blocks from the bridge when she heard the first sound, not footsteps. Something heavier, deliberate, a wet, rhythmic percussion. She recognized the way you recognize thunder before the sky breaks with your body before your mind. She stopped. The alley to her left was a slot of absolute dark between 2 leaning tenements, and from it came a smell she knew intimately from her years in surgical wards, iron and open flesh, blood, and a great deal of it. Any sensible person would have walked on. She turned into the alley, her lamp a small brass thing clipped to her satchel through a disk of light across the cobblestones, and found him. He was enormous, even collapsed. That was the first thing she registered, the sheer scale of the man folded against the alley wall, one long leg bent, one hand pressed flat against the stone as if trying to push himself back to standing through sheer will. His coat was black, heavy, and soaked through on the left side. His head was down. Dark hair fell across his face. 3 bolts. That was what she counted in the span of a single breath. 3 iron crossbow bolts buried in his torso, one in the shoulder, one beneath the ribs, and one in a location that made her stomach drop because it was close, dangerously close, to where the heart would be on anyone else. He looked up. The lamplight caught his eyes. And Mara did not scream, not because she was brave, but because the sound simply died somewhere between her lungs and her throat. His eyes were silver, not gray, not pale blue. Silver, like hammered metal catching light, and they were lit from some source she could not explain, a faint luminescence that pulsed once and then steadied. His face was striking in the way that ruins were striking, all sharp angles and old damage. A jaw carved by something that had taken its time, a mouth set in a line of absolute, exhausted control. He was not human. She had suspected it before she turned into the alley. The blood, the smell, the old quarter, the hour, they were a sentence, and she had simply been reading it to its end. Don't, he said. His voice was low and fractured at the edges, like a bell that had been cracked. Don't come closer. Mara came closer. I'm a healer, she said. Because that was the only answer she had ever had for that particular instruction. I know what you are. His silver eyes tracked her slow, precise, the way a predator watches when it no longer has the strength to lunge. You smell of willow bark and old grief. Leave, mortal woman. I am not something you can fix. The bolt near your heart would disagree. She crouched 2 feet from him, setting her lamp on the cobblestones, opening her satchel. Iron. A pause. Something moved across his face. Not surprise exactly, more like recalibration. Yes, House Marin's work then. They favor iron-tipped bolts. She had heard this at market, in whispered fragments, traded over bread and hard cheese. The kind of information that circulated among people who lived close to the old quarter and paid attention to the sky at night. They wouldn't use silver on someone they wanted to suffer. His jaw tightened. You know the houses. I know of them. She pulled on her thin leather gloves. Everyone in Veldrath knows of them the way they know of storms. You don't study storms. You survive them. He was quiet for a moment. Then, removing the bolts will not help me the way it would help a man. I know. The iron is in my bloodstream. It is slowing me considerably. I know that too. She met his silver eyes steadily. She was afraid. Of course she was afraid. Her hands were not quite steady and the cold radiating off him was wrong. Deeply wrong, like standing near a door that opened onto winter. But fear, she had learned, was information, not instruction. If I remove them and pack the wounds, will you be able to move? Another silence. Longer this time. Why would you help me? He asked, and the question was not hostile. It was genuinely, almost painfully, bewildered. As if the concept required translation, Mara thought of the clinic they had shuttered. The patients turned away. The colleagues who had not shown up to testify at her trial. The fiancé who had handed her betrayal with both hands and then walked into the sunlight while she stood in the ruins. Because you're bleeding, she said simply. And I still know how to stop it. She reached for the first bolt, and the night held its breath around them both. Chapter 2. Shelter in the dark house. He did not thank her. That was the first thing Mara noticed as she worked. The absence of the social reflexes that humans were like armor against discomfort. No thank you, no, you really don't have to. No nervous laugh to fill the silence while her hands did difficult things. He simply watched her. Silver eyes, tracking every movement with that unnerving, predatory patience. And said nothing at all unless she asked him a direct question. Hold still, she murmured. Fingers wrapped around the shaft of the first bolt. I am holding still. You're bracing. It's different. If you clench the muscle around the bolt when I pull, you'll tear the tissue wider. She glanced up at him. I've done this before. Trust the process. Something shifted in his expression. The faintest compression at the corner of his mouth. Not quite contempt. Not quite amusement. Trust, he repeated, as though the word were an artifact from a language he had once spoken fluently and now only half remembered. 3 seconds, she said. Then it's done. She pulled on too. He made no sound. That was the second thing she noticed. Not a hiss, not even a sharp exhale. Just that silver gaze, steady as a fixed star. Watching her fold clean linen against the wound with the focused efficiency of someone who had learned that stillness under pain was its own kind of power. The second bolt will be worse, she told him. The angle is wrong. Do it. By the time she reached the third, the one that had made her stomach drop in the alley, she was working purely on instinct. Her mind quiet and clear in the way it only ever got during crisis. There was no courtroom here. No colleagues averting their eyes. No fiancé's carefully neutral voice explaining that her reputation had become professionally inconvenient. There was only iron and flesh, and the task of keeping something alive that probably should not still be alive, by any measure. She understood. The third bolt came free with a sound she would not let herself think about. He exhaled then, just once. A long, controlled release of breath that told her more than any word could about what the iron had cost him. How long have they been in you? She asked, pressing the last of her clean linen to the wound. 2 hours. Perhaps 3. And you've been in this alley the whole time? House Marin's scouts patrol in pairs. There were still 2 unaccounted for. Mara looked up at him. You were waiting to be certain they were gone before you moved. I was waiting to be certain no one would be harmed on my behalf. He said it the way someone states a fact about weather without inflection, without expectation of recognition. The sky is gray. I will not let bystanders die from my miscalculation. She sat back on her heels and studied him with the same directness she had once used to read an X-ray, looking for the structural truth beneath the surface. The wounds were packed as well as she could manage in an alley with lamplight and a field kit. The bleeding had slowed with a speed that was not medically possible, and she was choosing not to examine that too closely right now. You need shelter, she said. Somewhere to do whatever it is you do to heal. Day sleep, he said. I need 4 hours of it before dawn, undisturbed, in a space without iron fixtures. His eyes moved to her satchel. You have iron clamps in that bag. I'll remove them. She was already reaching in, setting the small iron instruments aside on the cobblestones. There, can you stand? The process of him standing was something she would remember for a long time afterward. Not because it was graceful. It wasn't, not entirely. Not with 3 fresh wounds and iron still tracing through his blood, but because of the sheer, grinding determination of it. He used the wall. He used his own locked jaw and some reserve of will she could not name. He did not ask for her hand, and she gave it anyway. Shouldering up under his left arm before he could refuse, he went rigid at the contact. Easy, she said softly, the voice she used on patients in shock, low and steady as a held flame. I've got you. A silence. Then, with obvious effort, I don't. He stopped. I know, she said. Neither do I. Keep moving. His house was not what she expected. She had imagined. In the brief, cold walk through fog-drowned streets, something like the house manners she had heard described, obsidian gates, carved bone railings, the performative architecture of old wealth and older threat. Instead, he directed her through a narrow door on a forgotten street, the kind of street that didn't appear on any city map. The kind that existed only because Veldrath had been built in layers over centuries, and sometimes the older city simply refused to be covered over. Inside was tall, vaulted, and very dark. High shelves of books lined every wall from floor to ceiling, and a wide fireplace held the gray ghost of an old fire. The furniture was sparse and excellent, the kind that had outlasted the people who commissioned it. Candles, unlit, stood in iron. No. She looked more carefully. Bronze, all bronze. Not a trace of iron anywhere. He had built himself a space without it. Long before tonight, she lit the candles, while he lowered himself into a high-backed chair with the careful deliberation of a man managing serious pain. The candlelight changed him, softened the harsh angles slightly, caught the silver of his eyes and turned them briefly, startlingly warm. You should leave before dawn, he said. Mara looked around the room, at the books, at the bronze fixtures, at the single door she had entered through, and the fog pressing against the one narrow window. House Marin's scouts, she said. The two unaccounted for. He said nothing, which was its own answer. She set her satchel down on the floor beside the fireplace, unbuttoned her coat, and sat. Then I'll stay until it's safe. The silence that followed was long and strange, and full of something neither of them had a name for yet. He did not tell her to leave again. Chapter 3. Strange hunger. She learned his habits the way she had always learned difficult things, by watching quietly and drawing no attention to the watching. His name, he had offered sometime around the second hour. In the same tone one might give a street address, functional, stripped of ceremony. Seal, just the one word delivered without last name or title, as though both had been set down somewhere long ago, and he had simply never gone back for them. Mara had given him hers in return. He had repeated it once, very quietly, as if cataloging it, and then not used it again. The fire she had rebuilt from the cold ashes was small, but determined. Outside, the fog had thickened to the consistency of carded wool, pressing flat against the narrow window, and somewhere in its depths she had heard once, then again, the sound of footsteps that stopped too abruptly to be accidental. She had not mentioned this to Seal. His wounds were freshly packed, and his color, which had been the gray-white of old candle wax when she first found him, had shifted incrementally towards something she might cautiously call living. And she did not want to cost him the stillness he needed. Instead, she watched. He did not breathe consistently. This was the first thing she catalogued with clinical precision, tucking it alongside the other observations she was building into a quiet internal record. Not that he didn't breathe at all. He did, periodically, in slow and apparently deliberate draws, as though respiration for him was a choice rather than a reflex. When he forgot to maintain the performance of it, the rise and fall of his chest simply stopped, and the room became very still. And Mara would find herself holding her own breath in some unconscious act of mirroring. He did not blink at normal intervals either, and his hands, resting on the arms of the chair, beautiful hands, she noted distantly, long-fingered and precise, were consistently, impossibly still. Humans fidgeted. Even the most disciplined patient she had ever treated would eventually shift weight, scratch, tap, betray the body's constant low conversation with itself. Seal's hands lay motionless as carved stone for stretches of 20 minutes or more. She was staring. Ask, he said, without opening his eyes. Mara did not startle. She had been waiting for that. Your chest stopped moving for approximately 4 minutes. I know. Is that, do you require intervention? Or is that normal? The word came out dry, edged with something that might have been the skeleton of a sardonic humor, ancient and mostly fossilized. For what I am. She turned this over. And what are you exactly? He opened his eyes then. The candlelight made his silver irises look almost amber at the outer edges, a trick of warm light on strange biology. And he regarded her with an expression she was beginning to recognize. That particular quality of assessing that seemed to be his resting state, as though every interaction was a calculation. He was perpetually running. You already know, he said. I know the word people use. She kept her voice even, clinical. The Voice of someone interested in accurate diagnosis rather than drama. I want to know what it means. The real version, not the market stories. A pause. He tilted his head very slightly. Another inhuman quality, that precise, bird-like angle of consideration. Why? Because I'm sitting in your house in the middle of the night, and I've packed 3 of your wounds, and I'd like to understand the patient. Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile. The ghost of the architecture of one. The market stories are not entirely wrong, he said finally. They simply have the proportions wrong. We are not the mindless hunger they describe. We are, he stopped. Chose again. We are appetite with memory. The hunger is real, but so is the choice, the feeding, she said carefully. It's consensual, between always. The single word came out with sudden, quiet force, the first time she had heard anything approaching passion in his voice. And it was cold passion, the kind forged from long principle rather than feeling. Under house law, feeding without full consent is a capital violation, punishable by the severance. What's the severance? You don't want to know. I do actually. He looked at her for a long moment. The permanent removal of the feeding instinct, via extraction. He let that settle. No vampire has survived it intact. Mara absorbed this, filed it. And House Marin? The ones who shot you. They believe the law is a weakness. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. They have believed this for centuries, and they have been building towards something that will make their belief everyone's problem. His silver eyes moved to the window. They are part of why I was in the old quarter tonight. You were watching them, gathering evidence for the night court. A beat. I was not supposed to be seen. The hesitation before did not escape her. She filed that too. You're healing faster than you should be, than a human would. Even so, she studied the linen she had pressed against his ribs. The bleeding had stopped entirely now, not slowed, stopped, and beneath her careful bandagging she could feel, faintly, the tissue knitting in a way that had no medical name she knew. What do you need to complete it? The healing. The quality of his silence changed. She understood, in the pause before he answered, exactly what he needed, and why he was not going to ask for it. Not from you, he said, very quietly. I'm not offering. She met his eyes steadily. I'm asking what you need so I understand what I'm dealing with. There's a difference. He held her gaze for a long, unreadable moment. Sleep, he said at last. And time. The wounds will close by the second day sleep. The iron in my blood will take longer. He paused. And distance from you would help. Why? Another silence. This one had a different texture entirely. Careful. And underneath the care, something raw. Because, he said slowly, you smell of warmth and old kindness, and I have not been near either in a very long time. And I am currently at a disadvantage that makes things difficult to manage. Mara looked at him for a long moment, then she moved her chair to feet further away, folded her coat across her knees, and opened the nearest book from the shelf beside her without comment. It was the most respectful thing anyone had done for him. He would think later, in a very long time. Not retreat, not fear, just accommodation. Clean and uncomplicated. He closed his eyes. Outside, the fog breathed against the glass, and the footsteps did not return. And the candles burned low and steady, and Mara Voss kept her quiet vigil, and asked nothing more of the dark. Chapter 4. The things we carried on came to Veldrath like an apology. Slow, gray, and uncertain, Mara woke in the chair with a crick in her neck and the particular disorientation of someone who had fallen asleep somewhere unfamiliar and spent the first 3 seconds of consciousness cataloging threat. Stone ceiling, bronze candle sconces burned to their last inch, the smell of old books and extinguished wax, and beneath it all, that cold, clean scent she was already beginning to associate with seal like winter air through an open window. Like something that had existed long before the city was built around it. He was not in his chair. She was on her feet before the thought fully formed, scanning the room with quick, practiced eyes. Healer's reflex, always count the living, always account for the ones in your care, and found him standing at the far end of the room before a narrow door she hadn't noticed the night before. He was dressed differently. The ruined coat was gone. He wore dark, plain clothes that fit him with the understated precision of things made specifically for one body, and he was holding a shallow ceramic bowl in both hands with the careful attention of someone performing a task that required more concentration than it appeared. You're standing, she said. I am. He did not turn around. That's faster than I expected. Day sleep accelerates it considerably. He set the bowl down on a low table near the door and finally turned to face her. The wounds were still present. She could see the careful way he held his left side, the slight protective curl of his shoulder, but the gray-white pallor of the previous night had receded. He looked, if not well, then at least inhabited, as though something essential had returned to take up residence behind his eyes. I made you something. Mara crossed the room and looked into the bowl. Tea, actual tea, pale gold and still steaming faintly, with what appeared to be a piece of dark bread balanced across the rim of the bowl. She looked up at him. He was watching the middle distance with the elaborate casualness of someone working very hard to appear indifferent to the reception of their offering. Thank you, she said softly. The elaborate casualness intensified. You were in my house for 6 hours. The least functional courtesy requires seal. He stopped. Thank you, she said again, and picked up the bowl. They ate, she ate. He sat at the low table in a silence that had shifted overnight from the careful, loaded quiet of two strangers calculating each other's danger into something marginally more comfortable. Not easy, not yet, but breathable. She asked about the books. It seemed a safe geography, and she was genuinely curious. The shelves ran floor to ceiling on every wall, densely packed, organized in a system she couldn't immediately decode. Languages she recognized: Veldrath Common, Old Meridian, the Angular script of the eastern provinces, and several she did not. How many languages do you read? She asked. 14 fluently, he considered. 19 with a dictionary. She absorbed this with a nod. How old are you? The pause was brief. Old enough that the number stopped feeling meaningful some time ago. That's not an answer. It's the honest one. He turned his silver eyes to the shelves. When you have lived through 11 distinct political regimes, 4 major wars, and the complete replacement of a city's architectural identity twice over, the number becomes theoretical. Like asking how deep the river is. Technically answerable. Not particularly illuminating. Mara wrapped both hands around her bowl and thought about this. Does it feel long? Subjectively? Something shifted in his expression. Something she was beginning to learn to watch for. That brief, involuntary lowering of the careful architecture he maintained over his face, where the real weather of him showed through before he could prevent it. Some centuries more than others, he said quietly. The lonely ones. He looked at her sharply. She met his gaze without flinching. I'm not prying. I recognize it. The weight of long quiet. She turned the bowl slowly between her palms. I had 2 years of it after the trial. That was it. Was only 2 years, and it was the heaviest thing I've ever carried. I can't imagine. She stopped. I'm sorry. I shouldn't project. No, the word came out quickly, then more carefully. No, it is accurate. The quiet. He looked down at his own hands, those impossibly still hands, resting on his knees. I had a household once, long ago. People I was responsible for who were responsible in turn for the fabric of things. Daily life. Arguments over wine. Someone always leaving a door open in winter. A pause, almost imperceptible. That ended. How? Slowly. Then all at once. His jaw tightened. I made a political error. Aligned with a house that fell. The people under my protection were relocated. Scattered. They built new lives. Which was right? Which was correct? He said this with the precision of someone who had repeated it to themselves with such frequency it had become structural, load-bearing. I became unnecessary. And then I became careful. Mara was quiet for a moment. You became solitary on purpose. It's simpler, is it? He looked at her again with that recalibrating expression. You ask questions most people would not ask. Most people haven't packed a vampire's chest wounds by lamplight in a Veldrath alley. She set down her empty bowl. I think we're past standard social calibration. The ghost architecture of that almost smile appeared again. Closer this time. More structurally sound. Your trial, he said, after a moment. Tell me what happened. It was her turn to look away. The fire needed tending. She busied herself with it briefly, buying a breath, buying the small distance of movement. I was a clinic healer. We treated people the house's physicians wouldn't. Old quarter residents. The unregistered. Someone in power decided that was inconvenient. I was charged with practicing outside sanctioned medical boundaries. She set the poker down. The colleagues who knew the truth didn't testify. My fiancé provided a statement for the prosecution. The silence that followed was different from any that had come before. It had texture and temperature. When she turned back to face him, Seal's expression was the most unguarded she had yet seen. It's something old and angry moving quietly beneath the surface. The way deep water shows weather before the surface breaks. He betrayed you. Seal said, flat, simple, a verdict, yes. And you still turned into that alley last night. She understood what he was really asking. Why, after being destroyed by the risk of caring for people who could not protect her in return? She had done it again without hesitation. Old habits, she said softly. The same words she had used to herself in the fog, hours and a lifetime ago. But she heard them differently now, in the bronze candlelight of his careful, ancient shelter, with the tea he had made her still warm in her hands, not damage, not compulsion, just herself. Stubbornly, inconveniently, still herself. Seal looked at her for a long time. Your fiancé, he said quietly, was a fool. Mara laughed, a small, surprised sound, like something that had forgotten how. She pressed her hand briefly to her mouth, and Seal watched the laugh move across her face with an expression he quickly, carefully put away again, but not quite quickly enough. Chapter 5. The hunter's map. The message arrived at dusk, slipped beneath the narrow door on a strip of parchment so thin it was nearly translucent. Mara found it first. She had spent the day in the careful geography of Seal's house, reading, tending the fire, re-examining his wounds during the brief windows when he surfaced from day sleep with the slow, deliberate emergence of someone ascending from very deep water. She had learned not to speak to him directly in those first minutes. He needed a moment to reassemble himself, to pull the present back over whatever long distances sleep took him. She recognized that process. She had her own version of it. The parchment had 3 words on it, written in a hand so precise it looked typeset. He found you. She carried it to Seal without comment. He was fully awake by then, standing at the shelves with a heavy ledger open across both forearms. And when she held the note out, he read it in a single glance, and closed the ledger with a sound like a quiet verdict. Dress warmly, he said. We need to move. Who sent this? Someone who owes me a debt and has apparently decided tonight is convenient to begin repaying it. He was already moving fluid now. The careful guarding of his left side reduced but not gone, pulling a long coat from a hook near the narrow door. House Marin's primary tracker. He goes by Soren. He has found this location, which means we have perhaps 2 hours before he reports it and they send something considerably worse than scouts. Worse how? Seal looked at her. House Marin's enforcement arm is called the Hollowed. They are made rather than born, volunteers who surrender their feeding consent permanently to the house in exchange for augmented strength. Something moved across his face. They do not negotiate. They do not pause. They fulfill the contract and they leave nothing behind. The word nothing landed in Mara's chest like a stone into still water. And the people in the street? She asked. The neighbors. The houses nearby. Seal's expression confirmed what she had already begun to fear. Marin does not distinguish carefully between targets and proximity. He held her gaze, which is precisely the evidence I was gathering when they found me. Marin is preparing to dissolve 3 old quarter streets entirely, raise them under cover of a claimed plague outbreak. Approximately 200 residents. Mara stared at him. Why? Because those streets sit above the old catacombs, and the catacombs contain the original house compact documents. The founding agreements that give the Night Court its legal authority over all houses including Marin. He pulled the coat on carefully, favoring his shoulder. If Marin destroys the originals before I can bring authenticated copies to the court, they void the compact, and every protection law dies with it. The silence that followed was the kind that reorganizes a person. Mara could feel it happening, the quiet shift of something in her understanding of the last 24 hours. The alley and the bolts and the bronze fixtures and the careful, ancient man before her assembling themselves into a larger shape she had not previously seen. This isn't just about you, she said. It was never about me. He moved to the table and rolled open a large document she now recognized as a map. Veldrath's old quarter rendered in extraordinary detail, hand-drawn and annotated in at least 4 languages. It is about whether 200 people wake up in their beds next week or do not. She crossed to the table. The map was extraordinary. The old quarter she knew from street level was only a surface. Here beneath it, rendered in careful ink, ran a branching network of tunnels and chambers that extended under the entire district like a second inverted city. The catacombs. She had known they existed the way Veldrath residents knew most things about the city's underbelly, abstractly. At a comfortable distance, the compact documents are here. Seal's finger rested on a chamber near the map's center. I have spent 4 months documenting access points and Marin's patrol rotations. I was 2 nights from being ready to move. He paused. I am now considerably less ready. Your wounds, among other complications. His silver eyes moved to her face, and she read in them something she had not seen there before. The specific discomfort of someone calculating a request they do not want to make. I cannot take you to safety tonight without losing the ground I need to cover. The catacomb access is here. His finger moved. 3 streets east. If Marin's hollowed arrive before I have what I need, the evidence is lost. Then we get the evidence first. She said it before she had fully decided it, which was, she was increasingly aware, a pattern with her. Mara. He said her name for the first time. It sounded different in his voice than she had imagined. Careful and low, worn smooth by the single night's use. As though he had already been turning it over privately, and this was simply the first time he'd let it out. This is not your war. 200 people, she said, are not your responsibility. That, she said quietly, is something my colleagues said to me once. I've decided not to take advice from that position anymore. She pulled her coat from the back of the chair. What do I carry? He looked at her for a long, complicated moment. Then he crossed to the shelves, removed a slender bronze case from the lowest shelf, and set it on the table before her. Inside, nested in dark cloth, were 6 glass vials sealed with wax, each containing a dense, dark liquid that shifted with faint iridescence when she tilted the case toward the firelight. Blood seal compound, he said. Old house chemistry. Applied to a document, it authenticates the ink's age and origin beyond any legal dispute. He paused. Applied to a wound, it accelerates closure. Does it work on humans? Unknown. She closed the case and tucked it under her arm. Where do we go first? East, then down. He moved to the door. Stay close. Move when I move. If I stop, you stop. If I tell you to run, I won't leave you. The words came out with a quiet certainty that clearly surprised them both. Seal was still for a single breath. Then he pulled the door open onto the night, cold and fog thick, and carrying somewhere in its depths the distant sound of something moving with the terrible, even rhythm of things that had been made rather than born, the hollowed. Already closer than 2 hours. Then keep up, he said, and stepped into the dark. Mara followed without hesitation, and the door swung shut behind them on the last warmth of the fire. Chapter 6. Blood and Testamenteth. Catacombs smelled of deep time. That was the only way Mara could describe it. Not death exactly. Not decay, but the accumulated weight of centuries compressed into stone and stillness. The smell of a place that had been waiting quietly in the dark long before anyone living had been born, and would continue waiting long after they were gone. The tunnel walls were limestone, carved smooth by hands she could not date, and in the light of the small bronze lamp Seal carried, they glistened faintly, as though the rock itself were breathing. He moved differently down here, above ground. Seal's movement was controlled, calibrated, a performance of human proportion. She understood now. The deliberate compression of something much larger into an acceptable shape. Down here, in the dark, with no audience but her, he let the performance ease. He moved faster than was quite natural, with a fluid economy that had no wasted gesture anywhere in it. And the shadows seemed to accommodate him rather than impede, parting slightly, leaning away, as though the dark recognized something in him. How far? She asked quietly. Sound carried strangely here, flattening, and then returning altered. 4 minutes at this pace. He paused at a junction, examined the walls briefly. She couldn't see what he was reading. No visible marking, and turned left without hesitation. The hollowed will enter from the north. Access. We have perhaps 20 minutes before they reach the document chamber. You've been down here before. Many times. A pause. I helped build this section. She processed this as she moved. Which section? The Eastern Archive branch. Approximately, he considered in a way that was becoming familiar to her, that slight pause of a man converting between timescales. 600 years ago. I was younger then, less cautious about what I agreed to build and for whom. You built it for the compact. I built it for the then reigning Night Court, yes. Under specific instruction from the court's founding architect, he moved around a low hanging of stalactite without ducking, a reflex. The reflex of someone who had passed this exact point hundreds of times in the dark. I was, at that time, the court's primary enforcer. Before I made my political error. You keep calling it that. A political error. That is what it was. What did it cost you? The lamp swung slightly as he adjusted his grip. Ahead, the tunnel widened into a low antechamber. The walls, dense with carved inscriptions, she recognized vaguely as Old Meridian, the formal language of house documents. Legal and architectural both. My title, he said. My household. Several centuries of assuming anything I built would outlast the building of it. He stopped at the antechambers for wall and pressed his palm flat against the stone. Not searching, but deliberate. The gesture of someone who has done this before and is simply reawakening the mechanism. Beneath his hand, faint light pulsed once, twice, in the carved inscription. A section of wall shifted inward with the long, grinding patience of something that had not been asked to move in some time. Beyond it was the archive. Mara had seen libraries. She had seen the great public reading rooms of Veldrath's civic quarter, and the private collections of physicians whose wealth exceeded their modesty. She had never seen anything like this. The chamber was circular, perhaps 30 feet across, and every inch of its curved wall was shelved and packed with documents, rolled parchments in bronze casings, flat folios pressed between boards of treated wood, smaller documents sealed in wax and suspended on hooks like strange fruit. The ceiling was domed and covered entirely in inscription, and at the chamber's center stood a single stone table on which rested, beneath a covering of what appeared to be preserved spider silk, a flat document case of extraordinary age, the compact originals. Seal said. Mara crossed to the table, while he moved to the shelves, pulling the bronze vial case from under her arm. Tell me what to do. The blood seal compound 1 vial per document. The wax seal must be broken before application. The compound traced along the document's original signature lines. He was already at the shelves, pulling folio after folio with rapid precision, scanning, ray-shelving, extracting specific documents with the efficiency of someone who knew exactly what was missing and exactly where it should be. The process will take 8 minutes if you work steadily. She broke the first wax seal with steady hands and began. Seal. She kept her eyes on the document. What was your title? Before, the silence had a specific quality, not reluctance exactly. More, the particular weight of a truth that had not been spoken aloud in a very long time, and needed a moment to remember the shape of sound. Veilcore, he said quietly. Of the first house. Mara's hands did not stop moving, but something in her chest went very still. She knew that word. Everyone in Veldrath knew it. The same way they knew the name of the city's founding river and the face on the oldest coins, not as a living thing, but as history, as mythology, as the kind of name that belonged on inscriptions rather than in conversation. Veilcore, the founding title of the Night Court's sovereign seat. The architect of the blood compact itself. You didn't make a political error, she said slowly. You lost a war. I made an error, he said, with quiet, immovable insistence, that caused a war. The distinction matters. How long have you been in exile? Not exile. Voluntary dissolution. He pulled a document and held it to the lamp. I surrendered the title formally. The court accepted. I retained my name and my freedom and my obligation to the work, and I released everything else. He set the document with the others. It was correct. It was the right accounting. You punished yourself. I made restitution. Seal. She looked up from the document. He was facing the shelves, his back to her, and she could see in the set of his shoulders the careful architecture of a man holding a very old weight with practiced muscles. Those are not the same thing. The silence stretched long and taut. No, he said at last, very quietly. I suppose they are not. She returned to the documents. He returned to his search. But the air between them had changed again. Another layer removed. Another measure of careful distance closed. And neither of them addressed it directly because neither of them had the words yet, and both of them understood that some truths need space before they can be spoken cleanly. She was on the 4th document. When Seal went still, the absolute stillness, not the gradual settling of a paused man but the instantaneous, total cessation of movement that she had learned in 2 days to recognize as his early warning system. There in the north tunnel, he said. Closer than 20 minutes. How close? He turned from the shelves, his silver eyes faintly luminescent in the lamplight, and in them she saw something she had not seen there before. Not fear, but the precise, calculating alertness of a man assessing a situation that has moved outside the planned parameters. Close enough, he said, that I need you to trust me completely for whatever comes next. Mara sealed the fourth vial, reached for the fifth. I already do, she said. Without looking up, the inscription on the domed ceiling pulsed once in the lamplight, as though the archive itself had heard her and marked the moment in its long, patient record. And from the north tunnel, distant but growing, came the sound of the hollowed rhythmic, even and utterly without mercy. Chapter 7. Iron and Ingenuitish. Finish the fifth document with 40 seconds to spare. The sound from the north tunnel had grown from a distant rhythm into something she could feel in her back teeth. A low, resonant percussion, the footfall of multiple bodies moving in perfect unison, which was more unsettling than any irregular approach would have been. Irregular meant individual. Individual meant something with its own hesitation, its own calculation. This was neither. This was mechanism. Last one, she said. Uncapping the final vial, Seal was at the chamber entrance, his hand braced against the stone doorframe, head slightly tilted in the way she now recognized as active listening, processing frequencies beyond her range, building a picture of the tunnel geography she had no access to. 40 seconds, he said. Perhaps less. I need 30. She worked with the precision of someone who has learned that panic is a tax on the hands, and she could not afford it. The sixth document's signature lines were dense, triple-layered, the founding architect's marks crossing and recrossing in a pattern that required the compound to be traced in the correct sequence or the seal wouldn't take. She had understood this from Seal's brief instruction, had filed it, and now her fingers followed the logic of it without requiring her conscious mind to supervise. Mara done, she capped the empty vial, pressed the documents back into their silk covering, sealed the case. I need 30 seconds more. For one thing, we don't 20 seconds. She was already moving to the shelves, scanning rapidly. Iron. You said the hollowed are augmented. What augments them? A blood compound administered by the house. It heightens everything. Speed, strength, pain tolerance. He stopped. She saw him recalibrate. What are you thinking? Iron disrupts you. Does it disrupt them? A pause. The percussion from the tunnel grew closer, and now she could hear beneath it a secondary sound breathing. Synchronized, the in and out of multiple lungs timed to the footfall, which should not have been possible, and therefore was deeply, viscerally wrong. More so, Seal said, carefully. They surrendered their feeding consent to the house. Their blood runs partially on the compound rather than their own biology. Iron interferes with the compound at a molecular level. His silver eyes found hers across the chamber. What do you have? She had found what she was looking for, a row of small iron bolts, archival fasteners, sitting in an open bronze tray on the lowest shelf. Leftover materials from the archive's construction, 6 centuries old and still perfectly functional. She counted them rapidly. 14. Can they come through that door 2 at a time? No, the entrance narrows to single file. Then I need you on the left side of the doorway, she said, moving to the lamp and lifting it from its hook. When the first one crosses the threshold, don't engage. Let me go first? Absolutely not, Seal. She looked at him directly, and something in her voice, that low, steady clinical tone that had talked down patients in surgical crisis and frightened colleagues in corridors, and apparently, she was discovering, also worked on ancient vampire kings, made him go quiet. You have 3 healing wounds, iron still in your bloodstream, and your strength is at perhaps 60% of normal. I need you functional for the tunnel out, which means I need you not to take damage in the next 3 minutes. So let me go first. The percussion stopped. They were at the door. In the sudden silence, the sound of her own heartbeat was extraordinarily loud. Seal moved to the left side of the doorframe without further argument, and she filed that away as something significant that he had calculated. The same equation she had, and reached the same conclusion and trusted her enough to act on it. And then the first hollowed, crossed the threshold, and she didn't have space to file anything anymore. They were larger than she had imagined. Not grotesquely so, but densely packed with a solidity that suggested something beyond normal muscle mass. The compound Seal had described visibly present in the thickness of their stillness. The first one was a man, broad-shouldered, his eyes the flat, affect-free gaze of someone who had genuinely surrendered something essential to a house in exchange for this body. Not cruel, not angry, simply contracted. She threw the lamp, not at him, at the floor between them, specifically at the junction between his leading foot and the stone. And the oil caught immediately with a soft detonation of warmth and light that made him check his step for precisely the 2 seconds she needed. She had 3 iron bolts in each fist. Held between her fingers like uneven keys, she struck the exposed skin of his forearm, open-handed, driving the iron contact points against the blood vessels at his wrist, and watched the blood compound react the way iron filings react to a magnet. Violently and suddenly, the hollowed arm seizing in a visible spasm that traveled all the way to his shoulder, he dropped, not unconscious, not destroyed, but down, and the doorway was clear for the 4 seconds required for Seal to come around the frame and meet the second hollowed with the full, economical force of something that had been patient long enough. She didn't watch that part. She was already moving to the third, who was attempting to come through over the first. And she had 4 bolts left and a healer's detailed knowledge of where the body's largest blood vessels ran closest to the surface. It took 6 minutes. When it was over, 4, hollowed, lay incapacitated on the archive floor, and Seal was breathing in controlled, deliberate draws. His left hand pressed to his ribs, the old wound protesting the violence and looking at her with an expression she had no prior reference point for. She was shaking slightly. She noticed this with the detached interest of someone observing weather from inside a building. Her hands were steady. They were always steady when they mattered, but the rest of her had saved the trembling for afterward. Which was, she supposed, efficient. "You were a field medic," he said. "Yes, in a war, a border conflict. 3 years. She looked at the iron bolts still in her hand, then set them carefully on the stone table beside the document case. "I told you. I know where the blood runs close to the surface." Seal was quiet for a moment. Then, "We need to move. There will be more. I know." She picked up the document case and tucked it securely under her arm. The same position as the bronze vial case. Her body had already decided this was the configuration for carrying important things through dangerous places. "Can you run?" He straightened carefully, tested the wounded side with a breath, and nodded. "Then go," she said. "I'm right behind you." But as they moved back through the stone door, back into the archive tunnel, the lamplight gone now, so they moved in darkness, with only Seal's silver-lit eyes as guide. She felt his hand find hers in the dark. Briefly, a single deliberate contact and then release, not possession, not a claim, just acknowledgement of what she had done and what it had cost her, and that he had seen it clearly. She held the warmth of it all the way through the dark. Chapter 8. The space between they surfaced through a drainage grate 3 streets east of the old quarter, into an alley that smelled of river water and cold stone. And Mara stood in the thin, pre-dawn dark, with the document case pressed against her ribs and her lungs asking more of her than she was currently able to give. She bent forward, hands on her knees, and breathed. Seal stood several feet away, perfectly still, in the way she now recognized as deliberate management rather than composure. His silver eyes moving across every roofline and shadow with the systematic thoroughness of someone who did not trust the quiet yet. His left hand was at his ribs again. The wound had reopened. She could see it in the darkened fabric of his coat. A slow bloom she tracked with the involuntary attention of someone who could not stop doing the job even when the crisis had technically passed. "You're bleeding again," she said. "I'm aware. We need to." "I know." He didn't move immediately. He finished his sweep of the rooflines first, because of course he did. Because he was someone who finished the perimeter check before attending to himself. And she recognized this quality because she had it too, and it had never been a virtue. Not really. Just a particularly well-dressed form of self-neglect. When he was satisfied or as close to it as he apparently got, he turned and looked at her fully for the first time since the archive. The expression on his face stopped her. It was not the careful, managed neutrality she had grown accustomed to reading like weather. It was not the recalibrating assessment, not the ghost architecture of the almost smile. It was something rawer than any of those, something that had come up through the cracks opened by the last hour's violence and not yet been pushed back down. And it looked, from where she stood, very much like anguish. "You could have been killed," he said. His voice was controlled. The words beneath the voice were not. "So could you," she said carefully. That is, he stopped, jaw tightening. Starting again. That is a different calculation entirely, Mara. I have survived things that should have ended me 400 years ago. You are. He looked away, and the way he looked away told her everything about what he had been about to say and decided not to. You should not have been in that chamber. We've been through this. We have not been through this. He turned back. And now the rawness was fully present, no architecture over it at all. And she realized she was seeing something that he likely had not shown another living thing in a very long time. The unmediated interior of him, unguarded and complicated and deeply, quietly furious with himself. I took you into a situation I did not fully control. I allowed proximity to compromise my assessment. If you had been, he stopped again. A muscle moved in his jaw. I do not make errors of that nature. You didn't make an error, she said. We made a decision together. You didn't have sufficient information to make that decision. I had enough, Marcel. She set the document case down on the alley floor and straightened fully, meeting his silver eyes with the same steady directness she had brought to every difficult conversation in the last 2 days. I am 31 years old. I have worked a border conflict, rebuilt a clinic from nothing, survived a public trial and a private betrayal, and packed 3 iron bolts out of your chest in a lamplit alley at midnight. I have sufficient information to make decisions about my own risk. He held her gaze. The rawness didn't leave his face, but something in it shifted the fury with himself reorganizing into something more complicated and less clean. You are, he said quietly, the most profoundly inconvenient person I have encountered in 6 centuries. I'll take that. A long silence. Then he bent carefully, favoring the left side, and picked up the document case himself, tucking it under his arm with the same deliberate attention she had used. An echo of her gesture, whether he knew it or not. I know somewhere safe, he said, for the day. Not the house on the forgotten street. Marin knows that location now. A secondary shelter. He paused. It will require a walk of approximately 30 minutes. I can walk 30 minutes. I know you can. They moved through the alley and out onto a narrow street running parallel to the river. And the distance between them was slightly greater than it had been in the catacomb tunnels, slightly greater than it had been in the bronze lamped house. And Mara understood this without needing it explained. The archive had cracked something open between them, not just the trust, which had been building in its quiet, careful way since the alley, but something underneath the trust, something that neither of them had named, and both of them had felt in the dark when his hand had found hers briefly, and the warmth of it had lasted longer than the contact itself. That was precisely why the distance was greater now. She recognized the mechanism. She had her own version of it, the reflexive withdrawal after closeness, the body protecting itself by putting space between the feeling and the person who caused it. It was what her fianki's betrayal had made of her, not closed. Exactly, but careful in a way she hadn't been before. Checking twice before trusting, building the trust slowly and watching for the place where it would break. She did not blame Seal for the distance. She felt it herself. She also felt, underneath the careful protectiveness of it, a quiet, persistent ache that she was not ready to examine directly, but could not entirely ignore. The safe house was in the River District, a low building of dark stone set flush against the embankment wall, invisible from the street unless you knew the exact angle of approach. Inside, a single large room, sparse, immaculate, smelling of beeswax and old paper, bronze fixtures throughout, a narrow bed against the far wall and a daybed positioned near the door. He set the document case on the table, lit the candles. She crossed to him without preamble and rebandaged his ribs with the last of her field kit, working in silence, and he allowed this without argument, the allowing itself a form of trust. She had come to understand, perhaps the deepest form available to him. When she finished and stepped back, he caught her wrist, not hard, the lightest possible contact. She went still. In the tunnel, he said, very quietly. When you said you trusted me, his silver eyes held hers with an intensity that had nothing managed about it. I need you to know that is not a thing I will take lightly, not a thing I will spend carelessly. Her heart did something complicated. I know, she said softly. He released her wrist. She stepped back 2 paces. He turned toward the narrow bed without another word. And the deliberate way he did not watch her cross the room was, she thought, the most honest thing he had done yet. She lay on the daybed fully clothed, coat across her shoulders, listening to the river move beyond the embankment wall, and felt the ache expand quietly in the dark. She did not sleep for a long time, neither she suspected, did he? Chapter 9. Old Rules. New light. 3 days passed in the River District safe house, like pages turning slowly in a book no one was rushing to finish. The document case had been delivered through channels Seal would not fully explain. Via contact he referred to only as the archivist to the night court's receiving chamber, where it would be verified, authenticated by the blood seal compound Mara had applied in the archive, and placed before the sitting judges within the week. House Marin's dissolution plans were suspended pending the court's review. The 200 residents of the old quarter streets were, for now, sleeping in their beds. For now was doing considerable work in that sentence. Seal had been explicit about this. The court moved slowly. It was, he said, a body designed for permanence rather than urgency, and it sometimes forgot that urgency had opinions about the schedule. Marin would not move against the streets while the court held the documents, but Marin had other avenues of pressure, and the hollowed they had left incapacitated in the archive would have been retrieved and reported by now, and the shape of Seal's involvement would be clear to anyone paying attention, which meant the safe house was still necessary, which meant 3 quiet days, and the strange, suspended intimacy of 2 people who had survived something together and were now living at close quarters with the aftermath. She learned his rules, not because he sat down to teach her. He was not, she had established, a person who sat down to do anything he could do while moving, but because the rules emerged naturally from the texture of their shared days. The way the shape of a room emerges from the way someone moves through it. The first rule was the oldest: no feeding without spoken consent, freely given, not under duress or influence. He explained this on the second morning, unprompted, while she was examining the bookshelves. She suspected he had been waiting for her to ask and had grown tired of waiting. The original compact enshrined it, he said, standing at the window with his back to her in the way he favored when discussing things that mattered. Before the compact, the houses fed as they liked. The compact changed the fundamental terms of what we were. A pause. It is the thing I am most proud of having helped build. In 6 centuries of construction, that is the thing. More than the archive? The archive protects the rule. The rule is the point. The second rule was about day sleep, not a vulnerability to be exploited but a sacred boundary, inviolable under house law. To enter a vampire's day sleep space uninvited, to wake them deliberately or tamper with their rest, was among the gravest possible violations. Even in war? She asked. Even then, he said, and the absoluteness of it told her that this rule had been written in specific pain, by someone who had learned its necessity from experience rather than theory. The third rule she discovered herself, watching him on the second evening, when he moved to the far corner of the room with a small bronze cup, and stood with his back to her for perhaps 10 minutes. She did not ask. He told her anyway, when he returned, in the neutral tone he used for things he had decided to be transparent about before she could wonder uncomfortably. Measured feeding from stored supply, he said. I maintain reserves. It is managed, careful. He set the cup down. I would not ask you to be comfortable with what I am, Mara, but I would rather you understand it accurately than imagine something worse. I'm not imagining anything worse, she said honestly. He looked at her the way he sometimes did, as though she were a text in a language he read fluently, but still occasionally surprised him with an unexpected construction. You are very unusual, he said. You keep discovering this. I keep being surprised by the depth of it. She laughed, that small, surprised sound again, the one that kept escaping her in his presence, the one she had stopped trying to suppress because it seemed to do something to the quality of his stillness. A slight softening, a fraction of warmth returning to the careful wonder of his face. She taught him things too, though she did not frame it as teaching. She talked about the clinic, the real version, not the courtroom version, not the cautious summary she had offered on the first morning. The actual daily texture of it. The boy with the river fever, who had arrived unable to speak and left 3 weeks later reciting the names of birds. The elderly woman who had paid in preserved figs because she had nothing else, and the figs had been extraordinary. The particular satisfaction of a sutured wound held clean, the small, repeatable miracle of the body choosing to continue. Seal listened the way he listened to everything, with his full, unperforming attention, no part of him elsewhere. You loved it, he said. When she paused, yes, and they took it from you. They tried, she considered. I think they took the building. I'm not sure they took the thing itself. She turned the thought over, examining it from a new angle. She had not thought it quite this way before. I can still do the work. I just don't have a room for it yet. He was quiet for a long moment. I have, he said carefully, considerable resources and considerable interest in ensuring that the old quarters residents have access to medical care that is not controlled by the houses. He did not look at her as he said this. He was studying the middle distance with elaborate neutrality. These interests are entirely coincidental to the present conversation. She looked at him for a long, warm moment. Entirely coincidental, she agreed. The third evening, she found him at the table with the Veldrath map unrolled before him. Not the catacomb map, a different one, contemporary, covered in his dense multilingual annotations. She pulled a chair up beside him without asking, and looked at it alongside him. And he shifted the map slightly so the angle suited both of them. And they spent 2 hours tracing the old quarters' human geography, where the residents were, where the vulnerable clusters were, where a clinic could be positioned to serve the most people with the least exposure to house interference. At some point she became aware that his shoulder was pressed lightly against hers, and had been for some time. She did not move away. Neither did he. When this is over, she said quietly, meaning the court case, meaning Marin, meaning the immediate weight of survival. When this is over, he agreed, meaning something she suspected was considerably larger than either of them had said aloud. Yet, outside, the river moved in its old, unhurried way, carrying the city's reflections in long, distorted ribbons. And inside the bronze-lit room, two people sat shoulder to shoulder over a map of a city. They were both, in their different ways, trying to save and the ache that had been expanding in the dark since the archive was still present, still unexamined, but it was a different kind now. Not the ache of distance, the ache of proximity, and the knowledge of what proximity meant, and the tentative, terrifying possibility that it might be allowed to mean it. She leaned slightly into his shoulder. He did not pull away. The candle burned low between them, steady and small and very bright. Chapter 10. The sovereign choice. If he came. At the third hour of the fourth night, Mara woke to Seal's hand on her shoulder. One touch, immediately withdrawn, and the quality of his stillness telling her everything before he spoke a word. She was upright and reaching for her coat before full consciousness arrived, and she saw in the fractional movement of his expression something that had not been there during the archive siege, not calculation, not the managed alertness of a man assessing exterior threat, fear, old and specific, and directed entirely at her. How many? She asked. 7. And Soren, he was already at the door, his body positioned between her and the entrance with an instinct so deeply wired it preceded thought. Soren has authority to negotiate. The other 7 do not. Then we talked to Soren. Mara Seal. She came to stand beside him, not behind. Beside, and felt him register this in the slight adjustment of his posture, the way he recalibrated to accommodate her presence at his flank rather than his rear. We have the documents. The court has them. Marin has nothing to gain from violence now except retaliation, and they are not yet stupid enough to retaliate against a night court proceeding in open view. She paused. Are they? His silver eyes moved to her. The fear was still present, underneath the recalculation. No, he said quietly, but they may attempt to remove the primary witness to the catacomb authentication before the court convenes. The primary witness was her. She absorbed this. Then we don't let them separate us. He held her gaze for one long, unguarded moment. Then he opened the door. Soren was smaller than she had imagined from Seal's brief descriptions. Compact, precise, dressed in House Marin's gray with the kind of understatement that announced its own significance. He stood at the head of 7 hollowed, arranged in a loose arc across the narrow embankment street, and when Seal stepped out with Mara at his side, something moved briefly across Soren's face. Surprise, recalibrated immediately into a diplomat's careful neutrality. Veilcore, he said. The old title, deliberate, that name is retired, Seal said. The night court disagrees. Soren reached inside his coat and produced a document. Heavy parchment, formal seals, the dense script of official house correspondence. He held it out. Delivered to my house 2 hours ago. The court has reviewed the compact originals. Authentication confirmed. A pause. The court has also reviewed certain other documents. documents pertaining to the vacant sovereign seat and the question of interim authority during the present proceedings. Seal went still. The absolute stillness. They've reinstated you, Mara said quietly. Soren's careful diplomat's gaze moved to her with undisguised curiosity. The mortal woman, he said, not unkindly, simply placing her in his mental architecture of the situation. The primary witness, she said, and the healer of record for any medical needs arising from these proceedings. Which means I am operating under night court protection, and anything that happens to me in the next 30 seconds becomes a court matter. She held Soren's gaze steadily. You're a negotiator. You understand the implications of that. A silence. Soren looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Seal with an expression that was unmistakably respect, not for Seal exactly, but for whatever choice Seal had made that had resulted in this woman standing at his side, speaking the court's language with the calm precision of someone who had spent 3 days being taught it by an expert. House Marin withdraws its enforcement action, Soren said. Pending the court's full ruling, he folded the document and replaced it inside his coat. The hollowed will stand down. Behind him, the 7 dispersed into the pre-dawn streets with the silent efficiency of contracts fulfilled. Soren paused before leaving. His eyes moved between them, once reading the geography of how they stood, the particular way two people occupy shared space when something significant has passed between them. He said nothing about what he read. He simply inclined his head to Seal, and then a smaller gesture, barely present to Mara, and walked into the dark. It was over, or it was the end of this part, which was not the same as over. They stood in the empty street for a long moment, the river moving behind the embankment wall, the city breathing its slow pre-dawn breath around them. The sovereign seat, Mara said, I will address that with the court. His voice was careful. It is complicated. Would you take it back? He was quiet for a long time. I don't know, he said at last, and she heard in the honesty of it how much the not knowing cost him. A man who had spent 6 centuries being certain about the correct accounting, confronting the limits of the ledger. Seal. She turned to face him fully. He did the same, slowly, and in the thin early light his silver eyes were the color of water over stone, deep and clear and complicated. I need to ask you something directly. Yes, last night, when you looked at me before you opened the door. She held his gaze. What were you afraid of? The silence stretched long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, losing you, he said, simple, precise. The voice he used for truths that had been compressed under long pressure and came out clean and stripped when they finally surfaced. I have lost a great deal. Over a long time. I have made my accounting with most of it. He paused. I find I am not willing to make a similar accounting with you, which is inconvenient. She offered softly. The ghost architecture of his almost smile appeared. Fuller this time. More structurally sound than she had ever seen it. Close enough to the real thing that it made her chest ache with something entirely different from the grief she had been carrying since the trial. Profoundly, he said. She looked at him. This ancient, wounded, careful man who had built a compact to protect people he would never meet, who had punished himself for 6 centuries for one error, because he could not distinguish restitution from penance, who had made her tea in a bronze cup in a candlelit house, and not known how to give it to her except by setting it down and looking away. I'm not going to become what you are, she said. I've thought about it, and I don't want that. I want my life, the length of it, the shape of it. I want the clinic and the difficult patients and the figs as payment, and the ordinary human texture of things. She watched his face. Can you hold that? Knowing I'll be finite, and still yes, no hesitation. This isn't possession, she continued. Not protection in the way you default to, where you put yourself between me and everything difficult. I do difficult things. That's who I am. I know who you are. The quietness of it, the certainty. Then I'm saying yes, she said, to whatever this is. On those terms, he crossed the small distance between them to steps, unhurried, entirely deliberate, and took her face in both hands with the careful, reverent attention of someone handling something irreplaceable, and looked at her for one long moment before he bent his head to hers. The kiss was quiet, brief, warm in a way she had not expected from someone whose temperature ran to winter. When he drew back, the almost smile had become the real thing, rare and structural and wholly worth the 6 chapters of waiting, and she felt it rearrange something permanent in her chest. Partnership, he said softly. Not possession. Correct, She settled her hand against his jaw. Now, tell me about this sovereign seat. He laughed. Actual laughter, low and a little rusty from disuse. And she catalogued it with the same careful attention she brought to everything. The sound of it, the way it moved across his face, the way it made him look like someone who had been away for a very long time and had just, improbably, come home. The night court convened 6 days later. House Marin was dissolved by unanimous ruling. Its territories redistributed under court oversight. Its hallowed released from their contracts and offered restoration at the court's considerable expense. The old quarter streets were formally placed under the night court's direct protection. The 200 residents slept soundly and did not know why. The sovereign seat was offered to seal formally in writing. With the court's full ceremonial weight behind it, he accepted on the conditions. The first, that the compact's consent laws be expanded and enshrined in permanent, unalterable form. The second, that a free medical clinic be established in the old quarter, fully funded and politically untouchable. Under the operational direction of a healer of his personal recommendation, the court agreed to both without debate. Mara received the documentation for the clinic on a Tuesday morning, sitting at the low table in a room with bronze fixtures and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, with a cup of tea she had made herself, and a man reading correspondence beside her, who had not yet learned to breathe consistently, but was, she was fairly certain, learning to hope. She opened the documents, read them once, and then set them carefully on the table. "Thank you," she said. He looked up. "Entirely coincidental," he said. She smiled wide and unguarded and entirely her own and returned to reading. And the candle between them burned steady and small and bright. And outside the city went about its ancient, complicated business of continuing